We finally get to sleep. It's been such a long day. I actually thought for a second that I won't be able to come back. But look at where we are now. Back to the safety and comfort of our own beds. Are you okay? You look very scared. Oh, you're still recovering from the shock of the expedition? Yeah, that makes sense. It was a pretty traumatizing situation. Hey, everything's okay now. I know I was almost stomped by the female titan, but I'm alright now. See, I'm still alive, right beside you, as I always will be. And you're holding my hand right now. I'm real, you're not hallucinating, we're all well and fine, and we have to thank the universe for that. I know, a lot of soldiers were sacrificed today. But the only way we could repay them is by moving forward and doing our best to fight the Titans. If we continue to stay in a stage of grief, it's only going to dull down a performance. I'm not saying that you can't feel sad, and it's completely normal for us humans to experience these kind of emotions. But after the grief, we have to move on. We have to take on the hopes and dreams of the fallen soldiers and make sure all their efforts were worth it. Yeah, sorry, I tend to get carried away in this kind of talk. But I'm glad you're feeling better now. How about this? I'll stay awake until you've fallen asleep. And if you like, you can lie down on my chest. You're very beautiful, you know that? Honestly, you are the one that makes me feel like I'm dreaming. Every aspect of you is just magical. And it's indescribable in words. Actually, how about I read you a bedtime story? Would that make you feel better and fall asleep easier? Alright, let me just go get the book. It's The Little Mermaid. This is my favorite book ever because me and the main character shares quite a lot of similarities. Of course, there's quite a difference in our species, since she's a mermaid and I'm a human, but she lives under the sea and wishes so bad to go above the water, see and experience the land, a world beyond the sea. Well, I am longing to see the sea, to experience a world beyond the walls. The sea. A salt lake so big that merchants would spend their whole lives and still not get all the salt. There's more than just titans outside the walls. The fairy water, lands of ice and sandy snowfields. I joined the scouts so I could see that. And I promise you, one day, we'll be able to see all of these together. Okay, let's begin the story. The Little Mermaid. Far out at sea, the water is as blue as the petals of the loveliest cornflower, and as clear as the purest glass. But it is very deep, deeper than any anchor cable can reach. Many church towers would have to be placed on top of each other to stretch from the seabed to the surface. Down there, the sea folk live. Do not believe, though, that there's nothing but the bare white sand on the seabed. No, the most marvelous trees and plants grow there that have such pliant trunks, stems, and leaves that even the slightest movement of the water causes them to move, as if they were alive. All the fishes, great and small, slip between their branches, just as birds up here do in the air. At the very deepest spot lies the Sea King's palace. The walls are of coral and the tall pointed windows of the clearest amber. The roof is of mussel shells that open and close as the water passes. It looks so lovely, for in each of them lie gleaming pearls, a single one of which would be a prize gem in a queen's crown. For many years, the Sea King down there had been a widower, but his old mother kept house for him. She was a wise woman, but proud of her high birth, so she always wore 12 oysters on her tail, while all the other fine folk were only allowed to wear 6. Otherwise, she deserved such praise, especially because she was so fond of the small sea princesses, the daughters of her son. There were 6 lovely children, but the youngest one was the most beautiful of them all. Her skin was as clear and delicate as a rose petal, her eyes as blue as the deepest sea. But like the rest of them, she had no feet. Her body ended in a fish's tail. All day long they could spend playing down in the palace, in the great hall where living flowers grew out of the walls. The great amber windows would be opened, and then the fishes would swim into them, just as the swallows fly into us when we open the windows. But the fishes swim right up to the small princesses, ate out of their hand, and let themselves be stroked. Outside of the palace there was a large garden with bright red and dark blue trees, with fruit that shone like gold and flowers that blazed like fire in the constantly moving stems and leaves. The earth itself was the finest sand, but blue as a flare of sulphur. There lay a mysterious blue sheen over everything down there. It would be easier to believe one was high up in the air and could only see the sky above. When the sea was calm, one could make out the sun. It seemed to be a purple flower with its entire light streaming out of the calyx. Each of the small princesses had their own little plot in the garden where she could dig and sow as she wanted. One gave her flower pot the form of a well. Another preferred hers to look like a little mermaid, but the youngest made hers completely round, like the sun, and only had flowers that shone red like it did. She was a strange child, quiet and thoughtful, and while the other sisters added the most remarkable things they had taken from stranded ships as decoration, all she wanted to have, apart from the rose-red flowers that resembled the sun high up above, was a beautiful marble statue. It was of a fine-looking lad, carved out of clear white stone and left on the seabed after a ship had foundered. At its base she planted a rose-red weeping willow. It grew splendidly and hung with its fresh branches over the statue, down towards the blue seabed, where its shadow appeared to be violet and in motion, just like the branches. It looked as if the tree-top and its roots pretended to be kissing each other. Nothing made her happier than to hear about the human world above them. The old grandmother had to tell all she knew about ships and cities, people and animals, and what seemed especially delightful to her was that up on the earth the flowers had a scent, for they did not down here on the seabed, and that the forests were green and the fish that could be seen among their branches could sing so loudly and sweetly that it gladdened the heart. It was the small birds that the grandmother called fish, for otherwise the sisters would not be able to understand her, as they had never seen a bird. When you complete your 15th year, grandmother said, you will be allowed to rise up off the sea, sit in the moonlight on the rocks and watch the big ships that sail past. You see forests and cities. During the following year, one of the sisters turned 15. But the others, well, each one was a year younger than the other, so the youngest had no less than 5 years to wait before she could venture to come up from the seabed and see how things are in our world. But each one promised the other to relate what she had seen and found most delightful on the first day. For their grandmother did not tell them enough, there was so much they wanted to know. None was as full of longing as the youngest one, the very princess who had the longest time to wait, and who was so quiet and thoughtful. Many a night she would stand at the open window and gaze up through the dark blue water. Where the fishes swished their fins and tails, she could see the moon and the stars. Their gleam was admittedly somewhat pale, but through the water they looked much larger than they do in our eyes. If what looked like a black cloud passed beneath them, she knew that it was either a whale swimming above her, or possibly a ship with many people on board. They certainly didn't think there might be a lovely little mermaid standing below them, stretching her white hands up toward the keel. Now the oldest princess was 15 years old, and was to venture above the surface of the sea. When she came back, she had hundreds of things to tell. But the most delightful, she said, was to lie in the moonlight on a sandbank in the calm water, and to see close to the coast of the great city, where the lights twinkled like hundreds of stars, to hear music and noise and clamor of carriages and humans, see the many church towers and spires, and to hear the bells ringing out. Precisely because she could not come up there, she longed most of all for all this. Oh, how the youngest sister was all ears, and when later that evening she stood by the open window and gazed up through the dark blue water. She thought of the great city and all its noise and clamor, and she believed she could hear the church bells sounding down where she is. All right, there's still a lot more to go through, but this is all I'm going to tell you today. Did you enjoy the story? All right. If you like to, I can read more tomorrow. Okay. Good night.